Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from, wherever in the world. The stress in the room was like static electricity, just waiting for a lightning conductor. Those present were in the business of crops and charcoal and animal husbandry and codependent. Elections were upcoming, everyone was stressed, people had already been killed, and the impact on business was catastrophic. Many of you attending this webinar will be familiar with informal economies. For others in commercial organizations, that'll connect with the idea of businesses with multi-million-dollar turnovers. And whilst information is much touted in any context, it often depends on slow or at least predictable rates of change in the political context as a preferred state of being for doing business. Sudden dramatic change has massive consequences irrelevant to the political system. And anxiety and uncertainty, like the anxiety just described, is really problematic. So what ideas are there for those practicing and researching dispute resolution, for those involved in commercial organizations of any sort in dealing with the fallout of political conflict in their business? Welcome to the third in the series of the Acute Dispute and Underlying Conflict series, co-hosted by JAMS and FCIArb. My name is Isabel Phillips. I'm Director of ADR and Mediation Development at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. My practice has straddled the commercial and the political contexts, and I'm a conflict specialist and mediator in a number of different environments before joining the Chartered Institute. I'm co-moderator for this webinar together with Niki Borofsky, who I'll introduce shortly. Please note that this seminar is being recorded and will be on YouTube and available from about a week after the webinar itself. The webinar will be an hour and 15 minutes long, and after my short introduction and an introduction from Niki, there'll be thoughts from our three speakers today, followed by discussion and question and answers. So please start adding questions and that you have already in the Q&A tool. I'm sure you're familiar now, you'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And use the chat function, as I see that you're already doing, which is great for general discussion and any technical problems you have, so that our team can pick that up with you. So this is a series, commercial organizations and political, the third in the series, which is focused on commercial organizations and political conflict in the context of acute dispute and underlying conflict. And this series is happening in the context of the first full-scale interstate war in Europe since World War II. And we're very aware that we've got a global audience joining us, and many of you around the world will sadly also have experience of issues arising out of armed conflict. So this series looks primarily at the disputes level, so the disputes that come out of this, of deep underlying conflict, but we will try and differentiate this because the ways of addressing those things are often very different. Underlying conflict often requiring fundamental and transformational constructive conflict engagement over long periods of time, and that will become relevant later on. And we're looking at the profound challenges of our time in this disputes context: climate crisis, sustainability, public health crisis highlighted by COVID, and also issues around exclusion and inclusion. And we're focusing on the fallout of these things for civil commercial dispute context rather than the politics of any given current armed conflict. Today we'll hear from a mediator and an arbitrator and a researcher with ideas and examples of what businesses have and could do to deal with political conflict. So let me start by introducing Laura Abrahamson, fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. She's a mediator and also an arbitrator at JAMS, and she has international expertise in the engineering, construction, oil and gas and chemical industries. Prior to joining JAMS, she was Senior Vice President, Deputy General Counsel and Global Head of Litigation at ACOM. Laura is a FCIArb Fellow and a member of FCIArb's North American branch, and is also a panelist on multiple global arbitration centres lists, including the Hong Kong International Arbitration Centre and the London Court of International Arbitration. Laura, welcome. Next, we have Jane Gunn, Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. She is an expert in the field of conflict resolution, a trained mediator and facilitator, known to her clients as the barefoot mediator. She's listed as a global leader in Who's Who mediation and featured in Legal 500 Hall of Fame. She's the current president of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Professor Molly Mellon also joins us. She's Associate Professor in Political Science at Loyola University Chicago, and her current research focuses on the role of the private sector in conflict prevention and resolution, entrepreneurship, and peace building and UN peacekeeping. And I'd like to point to her recent book, The Building and Breaking of Peace, Corporate Activities in Civil War Prevention and Resolution, particularly pertinent to our subject today. Her broader research and interests include international relations and foreign policy decision-making, with emphasis on the causes of war, international conflict, and conflict management. The speakers and I are joined by my co-moderator, I'd invite to come on camera, Niki Borofsky, Senior Global Practice Manager at JAMS Local Solutions. Niki is an attorney, mediator, and promoter of creative, thoughtful dispute resolution processes. Prior to her role as Senior Global Practice Manager at JAMS, she was Vice President at the CPR Institute. She's worked in-house at Alstom, as well as in the international arbitration practice at Latham & Watkins and Proskauer in Paris, France. So, welcome, Niki, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen and just give a brief overview to welcome all of you and provide a little bit of context. And I'm going to whip through my slides relatively quickly so that we do not curtail the main event, which is our three fabulous leading women dispute resolution speakers that we have today. But as Isabel mentioned, this is the third webinar in a series, and JAMS is very happy and privileged to be partnering with the Chartered Institute for this timely and important discussion. I really want to acknowledge my colleague, Ron Howell, who was formerly with the global team, for his role in bringing this series to life. I'm particularly excited about today's presentation because it combines two of my passions, dispute resolution and politics. I had a former life as a political consultant, so I'm very aware of the kind of the trials and tribulations of regime change and the campaigns and the intricacies that go along with these kinds of changes and conflicts. I'm really excited to hear from our speakers. The bigger context for JAMS is, as soon as COVID started, we just pivoted and knew that this was going to open up the door to a whole new host of conflicts and challenges. And we came together internally with our mediators, our arbitrators, our panelists, our staff, and started a business disruption working group. And really, the purpose of this was to anticipate the needs of clients and companies, stakeholders around the world, and really to start listening, tailoring, and adapting, and being part of the training that is really representative of today's webinar. The framework is a little bit more delved into in the first two sessions, which are on YouTube already. But really the purpose of this series overall is to engage in the timely conversation about the overlap of conflict resolution and dispute resolution, and to use a framework of 5 pointed questions: what, where, who, why, and when, to help dispute resolvers and stakeholders from all corners really understand what's going on in the most fruitful ways to engage and make progress. As Isabel mentioned, there's a lot of conflict and challenges going on, from pandemic issues, health issues, armed conflict, wars, environmental sustainability concerns, and systemic social justice issues. And laying over this is the kind of conflicts that us commercial and more commercial dispute resolution professionals are used to dealing with. So supply web disruption, and notes that it's no longer supply chain, it's supply web. We understand that everything is complicated. breach of contract, stress caused with corporate relationships and supply chain relationships, regulatory infractions, and business risk, all tied in and on top of and between and integrated with and around the underlying bigger picture conflicts. So we're really here to figure out how ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is impacted by the underlying conflicts and how we can really address these issues in a more robust way. So I've mentioned before, this is just a little bit of a teaser. If you haven't caught the session 1 and webinar 2, they are up on the web. I really encourage you to take a look, and I'm going to provide just a little bit of a highlight to give you some perspective for those of you who are joining us in this series for the first time. One of the things that was discussed by one of our speakers was the role that crisis and conflict is playing in the energy industry. And the example that Michael used was how, stresses are created by shortages in vital supply chains, right? And he noted that this is going to trigger a whole new wave of disputes beyond the conflict itself throughout the industry. And that it's interesting, he mentioned how speed is really, the need for speed has increased. And the fact that we've all been so successful, many of us, in pivoting to virtual underscores the fact that resolution as well needs to keep up the speed and import those kinds of advancements. And then he noted that really a lot of what we're talking about is a enterprise risk management perspective that's being integrated into the ADR. Sheila Bates noted that there's going to be more risk sharing as we edge towards the future. And also, like it or not, we've got to get used to conflict and continuing conflict being the new normal. So we're in a series of crises. So we're going to have a little bit of stamina. The second webinar really talked about some interesting issues really on the outskirts and in different kind of portions of the toolbox for ADR. And our speakers highlighted the role that facilitation could play in helping parties and factions to come to better resolution. We talked about the role of negotiation and psychology. Tim Hardy mentioned that he was embroiled in a mediation where the parties had been fighting for years, and actually the realization they had was that they had the appetite to renegotiate the contract instead of mediate it. And then just the reminder that we're all human and all the parties are human, and you really have to key into the fact that the underlying conflict and political issues have emotional aspects. So today we're going to provide you with some amazing practical advice, war stories, examples of how our panelists have dealt with these kinds of issues. And this is the kind of what we're asking. We're asking you to listen, acknowledge, how are you feeling? How are you receiving what you're hearing? Learn, respond through all the methodologies that Isabel noted, and we're going to listen to you, and we're going to hope to have time to respond as well. So the overall goal, again, is really to take the confusion that we're all feeling, that we're all seeing, that we're all experiencing from all over the globe. And it really is inspiring to see how many of you are calling in from so many places, and to leverage our past experience and all of the expertise of our speakers and all of you to provide a roadmap, to give resources for commercial organizations, to kind of have that box for the picture puzzle so that we can recognize pieces that we're used to slotting into space and help us see, have a little bit more guidance as we navigate these challenging times. So that's it. I'm on to the main event. Thank you so much, Isabel, and I look forward to hearing what all of our speakers have to say.
Thank you, Nikki. So I'd like to invite Laura Abrahamson to come on camera, our first speaker today, who I've introduced briefly, but has some fascinating experience in the real cut and thrust of commercial dispute from a number of different perspectives. Laura. It is compulsory, of course, in every webinar that there's an issue at some point with muting. So great to have you, Laura. Over to you.
Thank you. So Uncertain times increase risk, as Nikki was alluding to, both political and financial. And in my experience for businesses, it's critical to effectively manage disputes in uncertain times by managing and reducing risks, political and financial, because particularly for publicly held companies whose performance is measured against market expectations, unexpected outcomes can significantly impact the companies and their stock price. To manage that risk, I suggest effectively you need to focus on two key things. The first is speed and getting to resolution faster. And the second is maximizing the likelihood of enforcement. In periods of prolonged conflict and upheaval, it can be very difficult for businesses to access local courts, and alternative dispute resolution becomes even more important. As we saw while the COVID pandemic created all sorts of disruptions in supply chain, or the supply web, as Nikki suggested, prevented performance of contracts and gave rise to significant commercial disputes. Access to local courts was often impossible, as they were shuttered in many instances for months. Arbitral institutions and arbitration centers, on the other hand, as Nikki suggested, were able to stay open and effectively help businesses have a place to turn to resolve their conflicts. Focusing on the speed aspect as well as the enforcement, I think that the growth of international mediation is an incredibly appealing tool for commercial organizations in times of conflict, because it provides both much infinitely greater speed and a greater likelihood of compliance with resolution. Both in the US and JAMS both have long histories of mediation. And over the last several years, major institutions have adopted mediation rules and procedures that I think are going to make it a much more palatable and accessible option throughout the world, including as recently as this year, ICSID, even in the investor state realm, adopted, which goes into effect in July, separate mediation procedures, entirely new procedural rules developed for mediation and fact-finding that offer a process to support a negotiated resolution of disputes between parties. One of the key aspects of mediation, because there isn't a loser or a winner as there are with arbitral awards, parties agree to a resolution, which in theory greatly improves voluntary compliance with settlement agreements. In addition, with the Singapore Convention, I believe as of this week, 55 countries have now signed and 10 have ratified, provides additional protection that if commercial enterprises reach a settlement and mediation, that there is additional enforcement capability if one of the parties decides not to go through with what they've agreed to. But one of the issues in my experience when dealing on behalf of commercial enterprises who have conflicts involving government or quasi-government entities is there may not be someone on the other side who has either the authority to negotiate or is willing politically to stick their neck out. I'll give you an example. Before joining AECOM, I was in-house with Occidental Petroleum for almost 20 years. And I don't think it's any surprise that if you look, I think fully 45% of the ICSID caseload are in the oil and gas and construction energies, so industries rather. So Oxy had a VAT dispute that arose in Ecuador in 2002, immediately after signing contracts obligating the company to make $1 billion investment. The director of the SRI, which is the Ecuadorian version of the Internal Revenue Service, stopped refunding the VAT and publicly argued that even though the investments were to produce oil for export, where that would normally be refunded and certainly have been the expectation of the company in agreeing to make the investment, that should be retained to provide money for schools. I sat at a meeting down in Ecuador with members of the US State Department, the Minister of Energy, and other senior government officials, all of whom told us that although they agreed with Oxy that we were entitled to the VAT refund, they didn't want to politically take on the head of the SRI. And therefore, instead of mediating and coming to an agreement, they wanted us to go ahead and get an arbitration award, which would provide them political cover to go ahead and get the resolution we needed. So what if you can't mediate, as in that instance? I think my second key takeaway would be to try resolving using the expedited arbitration procedures. And again, JAMS and almost all of the other major international arbitration institutions have adopted or improved their expedited rules in the last few years. Again, including most recently ICSID, which now, as of July, will be offering opt-in expedited arbitration proceedings. And this is because time can be critical. When you have significant conflict and financial upheaval, economic upheaval, it often leads to or goes along with political upheaval, including regime changes, even in democratic countries, which can impact a business's ability to effectively manage disputes. Unfortunately, despite the concerted efforts of a number of leading arbitral institutions in recent years, again, to adapt their rules and help move things along faster, arbitration under regular rules can still take years. I think the ICC 2020 dispute resolution statistics published last September show a 26-month average duration of proceedings that went to award. So going back to my Oxy example, it took 2 years to get an arbitral award confirming the company was entitled to the refund of the VAT. However, during that 2 years, instead of us getting the political cover we needed to then get our VAT refunded, there was political regime change, and the award ended up resulting in the expropriation of our assets. So I think, one of the other improvements in these, particularly these new ICSID rules that are going to come into effect in July that were adopted in March, there's broader access to dispute resolution and services, including the expansion of the additional facility rules which have been modified to provide states and investors with access to additional facility arbitration and conciliation, even when one or both of the disputing parties is not an ICSID contracting state. Regional economic integration organizations such as the European Union may also be a party in proceedings under the amended facility rules. So, in summary, I think, to effectively manage risk and effectively manage disputes, businesses need to be focusing on those things that will lead them to a faster resolution, and one where they are likely to maximize their chance of enforcing what that ultimate resolution is.
Thank you, Laura. Fascinating insight into, I think, one of the investor state cases that is extremely famous in the interim and teaches us an awful lot. For some of those of you who might have been at a webinar yesterday on investor state mediation, there's some interesting questions that we'll pick up later on. But now I'd like to hand over to Jane Gunn, who will give us a little insight about work within specific companies around risk and political risk and risks generally. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and hello, everybody. So, as Isabel mentioned, I'm known as the Bear for Mediation, and that's because I'm using my mediation skills to work inside corporations with clients, not necessarily mediating, but helping them to facilitate and actually helping them to think and make decisions, some of the things that we do as mediators with clients, help people think more clearly and make difficult decisions. And the question I always ask my clients, and I ask you now, is, are you sitting comfortably? And the answer is you shouldn't be, because I know, and we all know, that the last 2 years we've been navigating the storms of COVID, lockdown, Brexit, now there's Ukraine, climate inflation, food shortages, the great resignation, and then this threat of recession. And I sense, and I imagine that you do, that it's not over yet. So I think, as Nikki said, we're living in what we call a time of a cycle of crises. And looking back, the IOD back in March reported a dramatic collapse in business confidence. So the IOD's Directors Economic Confidence Index collapsed in February. In February, it was -4. In March, it was -34. And I don't know where it stands today in June. And the main concerns of some of the organizations that fed into that research were cost of energy. That has a huge impact on production and just having the lights on in your office, frankly. Inflation, and then labor market pressures. I know that many organizations are suffering from shortage of labor and staff retention. So these are some of the big issues. And so talking to one of my clients recently, who's a senior executive, what he's saying is the challenge is having to make difficult decisions at board level, but also at an individual level. And I know, and he was reflecting, that what keeps us awake at 5 a.m. in the morning is to say, I don't know how to manage. We've just gone through a pandemic. Now it's got worse. What am I going to do? How am I going to manage? And all of us have got to think, how are you, your family, your career, and your business going to survive physically, financially, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally? We've got to think of all these things at the same time. And so I think to survive in times of extreme disruption, we need to have a mindset and a methodology. So I'm just going to go through that really quick with you on 3 levels. I think we need to anticipate, to analyze, and to adapt, and to use this sense of awareness to focus on consciousness, not catastrophe. So if I look at anticipate, one of the things that I know that my clients tell me that they often do in terms of conflict is that they deny danger. So we typically deny danger, disbelief prevails over reality, and we fail to make plans. But Jim Collins, who's the author of Good to Great, says we must face the brutal facts. So when we anticipate, we have to sit down and we have to think, what are the brutal facts? What's really going on? What is my balance sheet telling me? What are my staff telling me? Maybe we need to ask and discover and dig a bit deeper to find out what's really going on, even though perhaps we'd rather not know the truth. The second thing we need to do is to analyze. We need to explore and tap into our own knowledge and experience, and maybe the knowledge and experience of others. Again, asking staff, asking customers, doing our research in the marketplace, reading the markets, working out what's going on, where are we going. So exploring much more deeply. And here is the thinking bit where I say to my clients, you need to think deeply, differently, and dangerously. You've got to do that level of thinking that perhaps is a little bit uncomfortable for you to uncover and understand where you need to go from here. And the third thing is adapting. How do you make then tough decisions? In these times, we all need to make tough decisions as individuals and as organizations. And so one of the things that one of my clients reflected back to me was we need to plan, organize, and structure so that we can deal with anything. Now, normally organizations have a vision and a plan, and they know where they're going. At the moment, we don't really know where we're going. And so it's important to be able to switch from plan A to plan B to plan C, and to be able to plan, organize, and structure so that you can deal with anything at all. And then where does mediation, dispute resolution fit into all this? Well, I think sometimes getting an external facilitator in to help can really help organizations to manage in these times where they need to do this deep thinking and make these tough decisions, very much as we would in a mediation. So my mediation framework that I use with my clients is a compass, in fact. And the N stands for what's going on now. We need to look very carefully at what's actually going on, what's that telling us. And then E stands for explore. We need to then tap into people's experiences, our own past experiences, dig a bit deeper and see what does the landscape tell us if we take a wider view. And then S stands for solutions. Certainly in mediation, we look, well, what are a number of different solutions? We don't just go down one track. We look to see, are there a number of different options, ideas, solutions? So very much some kind of brainstorming to think, where could we go from here? What are some of the options? What are some of the paths we could take? And then the W stands for walking forwards, taking action. It's really important in difficult times not to sit on the fence, but to be encouraged to take action. And then not only to do that, but to review that action, come back, test, are we going in the right direction? There is nothing wrong in times of crisis in changing your mind, in changing direction. I like to think of it very much as if you're in a sailing boat and you're able to tack through the weather and make changes in decisions. So just to summarize, this is about being conscious, and that awareness being able to help you avoid catastrophe. So consciousness, not catastrophe, using that compass to guide you and having perhaps a mediator or facilitator to come in and work with you at board level and at strategic level to help you make those analysis and tough decisions. And remember, it's about anticipate, analyze, and adapt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. So some really specific suggestions about how people within business can think about things, and some things out of the mediator toolkit. And I think as mediators, we often wish that people would use some more of those things when we're not present, as well as when we are present. So moving now into another area of quite remarkable insight. One of the things that has struck me as somebody who's crossed the boundary between the commercial and the socio-political context is that the two fields don't necessarily communicate and don't necessarily look at each other's business very much. So I'd like to invite Molly to join us now and to give us a little bit of insight into the research that she's done on how businesses and from empirical evidence, how businesses can contribute in situations of escalating conflict and post-conflict. Of course, in this context, in a nutshell, which is always a challenge for something as complex as this. But over to you, Molly.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thanks to JAMS and the Chartered Institute for having me be a part of this really fascinating webinar. So I think we're all observing really fascinating changes in the way that corporations operate, and we're increasingly seeing the private sector recognizing they have a really important role to play in peace and conflict. A lot of times corporations have started to really increasingly think about stability in the different areas where they operate. And so more and more we're observing corporate social responsibility programs that focus on a wide range of issues. We see separate foundations being funded by corporations. A lot of MBA programs are training their graduates in corporate social responsibility. And we also see non-governmental organizations starting to work more directly with the private sector and consult business operations that are going on in adverse conditions. So there's a lot of research in business schools, such as that by Timothy Fort and Jennifer Etzel, to name a few, that focuses on kind of instances where corporations and incentives for corporations to act as kind of good actors in volatile environments. What my research does that's different is drawing from large data to look at when these corporations are acting and the ways that they're acting and what the implications of their actions are for peace and conflict. And so I've collected data on instances of corporate engagement and kind of peace building type of activities. So community engagement programs that might help to train individuals, programs that might donate to local programs, investments in infrastructure, these types of programs, and what the implications of these programs are for peace and conflict. And so as corporations are increasingly engaging kind of beyond traditional economic exchange, are there ways that companies might actually be helping to build peace? And so there are kind of three main important findings that I want to share with you today that help us understand kind of when we're less likely to observe violence. And so one of the things that I find in my research is that corporations can really help to fill gaps in governance. And so in places where the government has kind of a moderate level of capacity, so places where we don't have instances of failed states, but there's still kind of a need or a gap in what the government is able to provide, private companies are able to kind of step in and fill that gap. So infrastructure is a major challenge in Colombia, for example, and Alpina Dairy is a company that has actually helped to build roads in some of the areas, which has helped dairy farmers get their product to market much more quickly, but is also a resource for community members. So the first thing that companies can do is to help fill this gap in governance. The second thing that companies can do that can be really effective is to act as a neutral proponent of peace processes and negotiations. So one of the examples that we see of this is the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet, which during the Jasmine Revolution was really proactive in making sure that the protests that were ongoing in Tunisia were peaceful in their nature. They used social media to connect with different members of unions to make sure that as they were pushing for transition to democracy, that they did this in a peaceful way. The Consortium of Business Industry, or CBI, in Northern Ireland acted similarly during the negotiations that led to the Good Friday agreements, just making sure that the way they acted was pushing for negotiations and not having kind of a say in the outcome, if you will, or not looking for a specific peace agreement. So being a neutral proponent of peace is the second thing that I find that companies can do to be really effective in promoting peace. And then lastly, corporations can be really effective in helping to implement peace agreement terms. And this is something that we don't observe as often as I think we could. So this is where there's really kind of an opportunity for businesses to be more proactive. And so frequently we see companies are operating in volatile environments, and they really have the opportunity to help both sides of agreements uphold peace agreements, because peace agreements are very costly to implement. For example, in Mozambique, they signed a peace deal, and part of the peace deal was that there would later be a donors conference. That donors conference gathered funding to help implement the actual programs that were promised as a part of the peace accord. But that donors conference only included international organizations and state actors. And I think this is one space where there's certainly a lot of foreign investment happening, but there's kind of an opportunity for them to behave in a way that would help to ensure future stability. And I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for businesses to start to think about conflict prevention, especially in settings where there's a history of violence. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Molly. Really fascinating. I've got lots of questions. I'm hoping that you all who are watching also have lots of questions. I'm just going to hand to Nikki for a second in case she has anything to add or to ask at this point.
I'm reminded from my years in law school when I actually helped one of my professors write a book on business and human rights, and then I later worked at Oxfam working on the private sector engagement arm of their campaigning to really find ways to pressure, help, advise businesses on how to do some of the, the three prongs that Molly was saying in her research were most successful. I mean, I think one of the questions, and this might be a real tough question, is, what practical solutions could you give for businesses who, are on the brink of trying to make those tough questions? Jane, maybe you have some advice, since you are kind of in the thick of it with your clients. What works best? How can businesses approach these things on a practical level? And you got to unmute yourself.
One of the challenges I'm finding with my clients is not leaving enough time in their meetings to make tough decisions. So it's one of the things I've just blogged about this morning, is that I feel people are running too fast. They're not able to leave time in meetings or make the space or structure. And that's why I think sometimes bringing a neutral in can help. It's just creating the space, if you like, to be able to think about these things deeply and then make tough decisions. Because in the normal run of things where you're operating in a crisis, you're kind of running faster than you can operate. And I think that's one of my top tips, really.
Excellent, Laura. Yeah.
I might offer, I completely agree with Jane. I think in a world where your diary is filled with back-to-back meeting appointments and Zooms, having the time to think and creating a space for all executives to be able to think through a problem matters. But I also think, going back to one of the things Jane said earlier, and also a point Molly made, relationships are often everything in business, just like in life. And I think businesses who invest in both their government relations and their community relations have access to better information. I think, as Jane said, to be able to understand what the situation really is now in times of volatility and extreme conflict. Having relationships with people who've done the government relations and the community relations, so they have all the information they need, plus the time to do the analysis, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. I think that that also relates to questions around dispute resolution process choice, right? And having the time to actually think about what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. And this links to something that came up particularly strongly in the first some of our webinar, but also last time, which is the whole issue of enterprise risk management in the broadest sense, and taking this time. And it just makes me think of the example where just by chance, an example from Ukraine, where a number of it was quite common that businesses had actually planned for a situation in which they had to set up business outside Ukraine, and that therefore some of them were able to literally start working again within a very, very short space of time. And it makes me think of some of the contexts that I've worked in where there's regular power cuts, for instance, and particularly, for instance, in the dry season, and businesses are sort of trained and focused on doing that. So I suppose in this context, it's an expansion of some of the things that businesses do already, but it's taking that into new areas. Are there particular things that you think that people are missing at this point? We've had COVID, which has alerted public health as an issue, and now the issue of armed conflict, particularly leading to things like supply chains. But do you think any of you that there are things that we're missing at the moment that are likely to be things that ought to be taken into those ERM processes?
Well, I completely agree with you, Isabel, that there's the old saying, proper prior planning prevents poor performance, and that businesses have increasingly turned to robust risk management thinking and practices as a way of coping with what you don't know what the next crisis is going to be, but there's almost certainly going to be a next crisis. And, I know at AECOM, we put a lot of effort into our risk management process and sort of rethought it over the last 3 or 4 years before I left to become a full-time mediator and arbitrator at JAMS, and quite successfully, because when, for example, Hurricane Harvey hit, taking, as you talked about, power outages, we were able to move things remotely and be up and running and make sure our people were safe, and we had communication systems and backups plans in place. At Oxy, when sanctions were issued against Libya in the face of the Arab Spring and some of the uprisings, at Oxy, we had to evacuate all of our people in a 24-hour period, and we had to make sure we were safely shutting things down. And there was all sorts of legal issues that came out with the making sure you stopped, you could comply with the sanctions, because how do you pay to facilitate getting people and their families out when you're all of a sudden not supposed to be putting any money or accessing some of your local assets. So I think it's, again, as Jane suggested, taking the time and space to think about risk management issues in advance, having a risk management group whose job is to take that space and think and anticipate what are the plans in case of an emergency that you can then fall back on.
And I'd add maybe, and remember to listen to the awkward squad in the room in those discussions who doesn't agree with everybody, right? Because consensus in that context, if everybody's saying the same thing, you're probably missing something, is certainly sometimes my experience. I'd like to pick up at the other end of the spectrum, because we're talking here about very, very large companies, and I'm aware that probably some of you are calling in from contexts where you're working with small and medium-sized enterprises in whatever context, and that's something that I think Molly's looked at. So I was just wondering, do you have any particular suggestions for the sort of SME level in terms of building peace or responding to latent conflict situations?
True. So this is what my more recent research has been focused on. And so I'm engaged in a project now with Santiago Sosa in Colombia, looking at the role of small and medium-sized enterprises in kind of building community level peace. And one of the things that we're finding is that small businesses really play an important role in preventing violence at the community level, because these are the businesses that are starting to hire people and are interacting with people in a daily way and really set kind of the environment and the tone in the environment. And so whether it means that you're hiring diversely or engaging with members of a different community than your ethnic group, this is kind of an opportunity for bridge building, if you will. And so I think there's certainly kind of a role for small businesses to play in terms of peace building from the ground up. And so as small businesses grow into medium-sized enterprises, a lot of times what we observe is that medium-sized businesses are actually kind of drawing resources into the community as well, because they need the infrastructure to grow. And so often this is kind of ground up development.
And I think that links nicely to, so I'm going to ask you all to participate in a poll, which just asks you very briefly, are you calling in from a private sector context, a public sector context, a charity or volunteer sector, another? And the reason that I'm asking you that is because one of the things that is quite striking about this particular area and some of the developments around things like investor state context is some of the questions about how private and public sector interact to enable processes like mediation to actually be used. just extending the discussion around the Ecuadorian context. I was lucky enough to hear somebody talking yesterday about some of the changes to the legislative framework in Ecuador to enable public sector bodies to participate in mediation. And it'd be interesting to see where you guys come from, and to see whether we've got the interest and the engagement from all these different sectors, because my hunch is we might have, but I don't know. So I'm interested to see. So we've got overwhelming private sector, but we have got just under 15% from public charity and other on this call at the moment. So I think that's a sign that there is some engagement from other sectors in this issue of how business responds, because it's so pivotal to what we're looking at. Jane, just coming back to you, are there specific things around early intervention that you think that can be done to prevent damage and loss specifically?
Actually, just to comment on what I was thinking before, with small businesses, it's cash flow. You know, large businesses can often survive, but small businesses, their cash flow won't sustain them. And I know, sort of going back out now after 2 years and going back perhaps to restaurants I've enjoyed going to, and I go and find they've closed. Or I went to one the other day when I was in London and they said, well, we're only serving drinks because we haven't got enough staff. So I think the cash flow and the staff flow are things that are really affecting small businesses right now. And so I guess, you know, in terms of early intervention, it's having a look at, you know, what's your greatest risk? Where are the areas where you literally are at risk of your business folding, which is not being able to sustain the cash flow and not being able to either retain the staff or, you know, have enough staff in the right areas to actually just keep the business going. You know, they wanted to keep the restaurant open, but they just didn't have enough staff in the kitchen to do that. So I think there must be a lot of businesses that are going to struggle, and they've got to really prioritize, I think, you know, where do we actually most need to put our resources and our planning in these times.
I think that just, Jane, what you mentioned really gets back to the notion of speed and
Yes.
the ability and flexibility of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and tools and modalities to be able to respond to these kinds of issues in real time and in ways that are responsive to the whole host of stakeholders that really need these matters resolved. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about ways that that companies and actors can proactively engage in ensuring that these kinds of processes are quick. If there's not access maybe to expedited arbitration, what are other ideas for ensuring that you know, you don't linger so long that you lose the battle?
One of the things I would suggest, Nikki, from my experience, is that having someone from the business, whether it's if it's a larger company that has a general counsel's office, and one of the lawyers can do it, or if a smaller business, one of the principals, to stay actively involved in managing the dispute. Don't hand it over entirely to your outside counsel, because one of the things that by staying actively involved, by, you know, having a business person attend that first procedural conference can do is they can agree with the other side on things that can shorten it and make the process go quicker that your counsel may not be free to do. Outside counsel doesn't want to give up on arguments. They don't want to, say, waive their right to take depositions if you're more in a US context, or other disclosures. They don't want to agree that necessarily we'll get to a hearing in 2 months or 3 months, because they want to have all the time to prepare the arguments and do the best job they can for you. If you've got a business person there, they can make those trade-offs on the spot and say, it's much more important to me that we get to a hearing. And I realize we might not be as prepared. We might not be able to put all the evidence and arguments we can in, but it's more important to me that we get to that resolution quickly. And I think so by having someone from the business actively involved, they can feel comfortable in making the trade-offs you need to get speed and take advantage of the flexibility that arbitration and alternative dispute resolution modalities provide. I mean, the truth is arbitration is a matter of contracted agreement, whether it's investor state with the treaties or commercial arbitration. And so if both parties can agree to a procedure to get to something faster, the arbitrators are going to almost always go along with it.
I think one of the things that, and I encourage organizations from the perspective of going on a journey and having a guide, is that you need a map. And for me, a map is a manifesto and pledge. And a manifesto means, here are my beliefs, here are the things I believe in. So I believe in alternative dispute resolution, I believe in early resolution. And a pledge is, I promise to use those. So I promise to my clients and to my suppliers and everything that we will have these early business meetings, that we will then move on to alternative dispute resolution, and that's upfront. It's part of the company's culture. It's communicated within the company and externally, and that means it's it is the first step. You don't have to think. You just know, right, we're going to step one of our dispute resolution process, and there it is. Executives will meet. Secondly, we'll try an external facilitator or mediator. So that's there and kind of written into the code.
I love what you're saying, Jane. And what we've noticed, I think, at GEMS is a lot of our clients are actually changing the nomenclature. Instead of having a litigation department, they're having a dispute resolution or prevention department. And just that small shift in mindset really helps the internal lawyers and the deal makers think a little bit more proactively. And then the other thing I wanted to just piggyback on what Laura was saying, another thing that I think is a real positive potential for the pivot to virtual that we've experienced is those people from the business side, the decision makers, the clients, can actually participate with much less hassle by popping into a Zoom or popping into a call. So really having a hybrid or a virtual process opens up the participation to involve those key players who can get beyond the zealous advocates that we all are, and the arbitral tribunal wanting to preserve a very fair and just process to make those decisions that might alter from what initially the contractual clause anticipated, because it wasn't made in a time of really dire circumstances. And the only other thing that I want to add in, and I'm sorry to be speaking too much, but another thing, a lot of institutions I think are re-envisioning the role of maybe an arbitral institution to promote different modalities. GEMS has a mediator and reserve policy. So as soon as you start an international arbitration, there's a mediator that you have access to that can pop in and decide discrete issues, or you can decide to kind of mediate. And I know CPR has that kind of functionality, and I think a lot of the other big organizations and small are really looking to that kind of option, especially with the growth of the Singapore Convention, kind of tying it back to what Laura mentioned earlier on.
I like the use of your phrase there, Nikki, popping, because I think we should have pop-up dispute resolution. I think it should be that instantaneous, it can pop up and we can use it today. We don't have to sort of have a laborious process to get into it.
I think flexibility of procedure and process is something that's becoming more and more a talking point, whether it's within arbitration, so med, and or we've also got a question here, which isn't the process that Laura just described, similar to the concept of having dispute adjudication board on a construction contract. So dispute boards are something that are being talked about quite a bit, as with other hybrid processes. I don't know if any of you have any reflections on that specifically.
I've worked on a project dispute prevention program, if you like, and I think just having that there means it's operating under the surface. So you don't even have to set it up. You just it's there, and it maybe it meets regularly or maybe it doesn't. But the one that I was in, we could meet regularly, and then the executive could feed into that. So it was a live a live process, if you like, into which issues could be fed. You didn't have to admit you had an issue to be constituting it. That was the thing. So there was no sort of loss of face. This board is meeting anyway.
So having something that's a standing entity means that you're not doing something exceptional. You're doing something that's part of the norm.
Yeah.
Completely agree. Sorry.
No.
I would say in my experience, in my years at AECOM, the most effective uses of dispute resolution boards were when, as Jane said, they were already set up and running and meeting before the first dispute came about. Because if you haven't, and the first dispute comes about, and you then need to constitute your dispute resolution board and get it going, you've already lost that time. I think one of the interesting things, going back to, again, the flexibility and Jane's point about the tiered resolution process, having thought that through and having the executive meetings, to Niki's point, the change to virtual of the last 2 years, I think, is going to give such greater flexibility to all steps and parts of dispute resolution. The executive meetings, which could be very difficult to set up in the past with schedules and diaries and timing to travel, now when they can be done, when people realize that you can effectively conduct business virtually, as we've all been having to do for the last 2 years during the pandemic, that increases the ability to have those executive meetings maybe be more meaningful. You can the other point is the UK has an adjudication regime to get the cash flow, keep cash flows going during construction projects. And I think that sort of idea can maybe be transplanted into other areas, because, as I was suggesting, in terms of flexibility, the adjudication is really sort of a quick and dirty process. It's not binding. It keeps the cash flow going in a very short order. The companies have to present their arguments. You get to a decision in 2 months or less. And when the project's over, people can go back and appeal it. They usually don't, however, because you've solved the problem by keeping the cash flows going. It's sort of the quick and dirty version, if you will, of resolution. And I think that also could be used much more effectively in other contexts.
And I think it's an interesting point, because I think it's actually a process, an adjudicative process. It's maybe not often called adjudication, because it's also probably not always happening in an English language context. But what you see is somebody taking an adjudicative role to keep things going in all sorts of contexts, in both formal and informal contexts, in a lot of the countries that I know are represented around the world on the call at the moment. I think one of the other things that links to that, which I'd like to pick up, is a question from Karim, which is that for many institutions, management is a relatively risk-free zone, but their satellite offices in the countries may be exposed to risk. And how do you recommend that the management gap between head office and satellite, but also the cultural gap between international and local management, is bridged to effectively manage times of crisis in satellite areas? And I've seen a lot of that, but I'll keep my mouth shut at this point and hand over to the panelists, including Molly, because I'm sure you've also had seen some of these issues around the world. So let me open the floor on that question, because I think there's much that could be said about it.
I do know of an instance of a Japanese company, they actually make sure that they're kind of higher up. People actually go and visit the original shop where the pharmacy began, and is now, a large corporate pharmaceutical company. And so I think there are kind of opportunities to bridge that cultural gap. Clearly, it's not always possible to, have people fly around the world to ensure that there's cultural knowledge, and also understanding when there are volatile places where a company is headquartered or operating, certainly. But I think there are some kind of interesting ways and innovative ways to make sure that people in one country understand kind of what the potential issues are and what life is like for people that are operating in other locations.
I think that's certainly a crucial point in my experience. Anything from Jay and Laura?
I've just had clients where I suppose they've had other offices within Europe actually, but perhaps further away. But in normal times, the executive from head office would be traveling, and so there would be this degree of connection and understanding, and then that's become impossible. So the communication together with the cultural difference has created challenge and tension, because they're not able to be on the ground with those people, understanding what they're experiencing. And it's the communication disconnect, if you like, that then starts to create tension and difficulties in decision making. And I suppose, again, that's where you come in with some of the skills and ideas that we have as dispute resolvers to say, how do you manage that situation and start to bridge that communication gap?
Thank you. Laura, any reflections on it?
Well, I had a gut reaction because having been in the position of working at a multinational company, and that when I gave the Libyan example of the sanctions, we were trying to get our people out because what we hadn't anticipated were the pets. People didn't want to leave without their pets, and we had to sort of pivot and understand that what we were thinking of and what the people who were on the ground they were thinking of were very different in their concerns, and similarly, we in South America and in Peru, we once there was a fatal air crash, and the immediate concerns on the ground locally were not the sort of things that people back at the home office were thinking. And so I think that goes back to relationships. And as Jane mentioned, when executives can travel and have boots on the ground, it does make a big difference. But in times when you can't do that, the relationships really come into play in terms of understanding the perspectives of the people in the satellite offices when there's crisis happening.
Yeah, I've been involved in a number of large internet governmental organizations that have offices, head office and satellite offices, and I've used tools like conflict style indicators and things like that to look at the overall dominant styles in head office and satellite offices, and it's often radically different, and that gives you some real insight on a systemic level as to the way that, for instance, conflict issues either within the offices but also externally in the context that people are working in are playing out, and therefore, for instance, why head office might not be being told about things that are happening, and the information simply not flowing. And I think there's also the element of the difference between sort of numbers and factual information, and as you say, the boots on the ground. But I think the boots on the ground thing is you've also got to think about the difference between traveling and staying in a capital city in a 5-star hotel, and going into to actually spend time in the example that's just come immediately to mind is the Niger Delta sort of 20 years ago. A very different experience than sitting on Victoria Island in Lagos, right? So it's just as an example of to what extent the boots on the ground thing works, depending on what the people with the boots are actually doing when they've got them on the ground. So just a little reflection there. And we've got another couple of questions. Sorry, Nikki, I think you're about to come.
No, well, for me, Isabel, that kind of segues a little bit into Jitard's comment and question, and maybe criticism or skepticism about how mediation can really work when there are such intractable issues at hand. And I don't think you get much more intractable than when there's an armed conflict. And I'm wondering if the panelists can speak to, is mediation, what kind of dispute resolution tools and methods can be successful when there is such an ingrained position that may be, in the dispute, and then also underlying the dispute and the conflict that the dispute is kind of seeped in. What has your experience been? What works?
I mean, I don't have any experience in that specifically, but I just think you can't beat listening. I think often people say, I can't go to a meeting, until, but just sitting down with no agenda and just saying, using those raw listening skills that we practice as dispute resolvers can start to build bridges. And certainly in the way I practice mediation, it's about very small shifts. It's about making shifts in that acknowledgement and recognition of someone else. I don't agree with you, but I acknowledge you as a human being, as somebody with a different point of view, and I recognize where you're coming from. And those small shifts can in time help to build bridges, but it's a process, but it just needs that willingness to say, I'll sit with you, and maybe with someone in the middle, but we'll sit and we'll just see.
I agree, Jane, but I also think that one of the things goes back to your anticipate, analyze, adapt, even in periods of intense conflict, I think getting parties to recognize where they really are, and one of the beauties of mediation is oftentimes you've got people doing like lens work and trying to understand the other people's perspective. So if you can accept sort of get people to look and face the realities of the situation, mediation is almost always going to be a better option for them. And, coming to a negotiated resolution rather than turning the fate of their dispute over to an arbitral body that, even if you expedite it, is still going to be 3 months off, maybe 6 months off, depending on the type of dispute. I think that as people globally turn to mediation more, they'll recognize that the power it has, because you really, with that listening and bringing people together, you can create a much better result for businesses. And with the ICSID new rules encouraging mediation and beefing up the procedures for mediation, even in investor-state conflict, I think will be a big step forward.
So I come to the mediation literature from a political science perspective, which is quite different from the perspective that you both offer, but in kind of the international mediation context, which is what I did my dissertation research on. We look at mediators as a person who can resolve the information problem. And this really gets at kind of why violence starts in the first place, and that is a lack of information. And so states disagree with one another on relative capacities and capabilities, for example, and the mediator can be a third party who can really provide that information and help overcome these kind of misperceptions that exist. And I understand kind of the international war context is quite different from the corporate engagement context and corporate dispute context, but I do think there's interesting overlap in terms of what role a mediator can provide when there's the possibility of conflict.
Thank you, Molly. I'm conscious that we are at 2:15. I said we would finish at 2:15. I'm going to take liberties with all of you who want to stay to take another 5 minutes, just to give each of the speakers a chance to give a final word and then to wrap up. So as Molly was just speaking, I'm going to go to Laura and then to Jane and then to Molly to just 30 seconds, your final thought for our participants today.
There's a question that came in a chat that I think will be my final thought, which had, should arbitrators insist that clients attend the first procedural hearing so they can influence the decision as to whether expedited process should be adopted? I would say that I would strongly encourage. I don't think you can insist, because you've got to have a client attend who really wants to influence the decision. If you as an arbitrator tell the parties that they have to bring a client, then I think you've changed the mindset on the client part, and you probably, in a way that doesn't create the space and opportunity for that sort of flexible thinking. I think you want to encourage them to have someone there, and then as they listen to the procedural conference, they can then intervene and influence it.
Thank you, Laura. Jane.
I would say, from my perspective, conflict always arises from a conversation that didn't happen or didn't happen well. So I ask organizations, what conversations are you not having and why? And I ask my clients to reflect on 3 questions. Who matters most to you, and why do they matter most to you? What matters most to those people? Could be their pets, you see. And why does that matter most? And then what matters most to you?
We seem to have a...
It wouldn't be a webinar without a
Right.
technical issue. Illustrating the difficulty with which communication can stop and ebb and flow.
So let's wait and see if Jane manages to reconnect, and I'll hand to Molly for final thought from you, Molly.
Sure, thank you. And thank you all once again for having me. I think one of the things that this webinar really highlights is there's a gap between what's happening on the ground and the research that's being done on these very topics. And so I just want to highlight to the audience that there is a literature out there and a lot of research that's been done that shows kind of success rates of mediation, for example, and when mediation is useful. And so drawing from that literature, I think is one way that kind of moving forward, corporations can be informed about kind of best practices, but also kind of acknowledging that there are gaps in our knowledge, and there's still kind of work to be done.
Thank you, Molly. And I'm going to hand back to you, Jane, for the final. You left us with a cliffhanger there. So we had the first and the second, and we're all on tenterhooks. For the third question was?
And what matters most to you, and share that information. I was conscious I dropped out. I suddenly think everybody's frozen. What happens? That's it. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Nikki.
No, I just think that, Isabel, it's a wonderful modeling of the tenacity and persistence, I think, that it takes in a mediator mindset to ensure that clear communication happens. And I just want to thank everybody for participating, and thank you to FCIArb for co-hosting this, and for everybody whose questions we didn't get to. I encourage you to be persistent as well, and feel free to reach out to me afterwards if there's something that you're keen on learning. We are really here to continue the conversation, and hope to see you at the next webinar in the series.
Thank you, Nikki. And I would like to just reinforce what Nikki's just said in terms of thanks to all the speakers today, and to the previous webinars, and for the upcoming one in a month's time. We'll be posting the link to sign up for the next in the series shortly in the chat. The one thing that I'm going to also take the liberty of adding to what Molly just said is the fascinating thing about the 2 literatures and the conceptions of mediation between the socio-political context and the social science context, and this more legal dominated context of ADR, is that even the conception of mediation does tend to be slightly different. So it's a fascinating thing. I encourage you to follow Molly's suggestion, and I hope that we can carry on having this conversation across these fields, because I think it is crucial to actually acting effectively in these really difficult times of acute dispute and underlying conflict. So I'm posting the link to sign up for the next event in what month is it now? It's June, so the next one is in July, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you, and good evening, good morning, and good night.
Thank you for having us.